Police drag black man out of his car, only to freeze when they see his FBI ID. A black man is pulled over by police for a minor traffic violation. The officers approach the car and, without explanation, quickly become confrontational. They demand that the man step out of the car, assuming he's a threat based on his appearance alone. Despite his calm demeanor, the situation escalates. The officers grab him and start pulling him from the car. In the struggle, his wallet falls to the ground, and as it opens, an FBI badge is revealed. The officers freeze, suddenly realizing their mistake. The black man, calm and composed, picks up the wallet and holds up the badge. The officers stare at the badge in shock, their earlier confidence gone. The reality of their error begins to settle in, and they are left speechless, the aggressive actions they took now completely undermined by the man's true identity. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The black man sat quietly in his car, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as he drove down a quiet suburban street. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the peaceful neighborhood. It had been a long day at work, and he was eager to get home. But the flashing lights in his rearview mirror told him that wasn't going to happen just yet. He pulled over, bringing his car to a stop along the shoulder of the road. The patrol car behind him parked at a slight angle, its lights flashing brightly, cutting through the fading daylight. The black man sighed but kept his expression neutral, already knowing what was likely to come next. Two officers stepped out of their car, their movements quick and purposeful. The first officer approached the driver's side, while the second walked toward the back of the car, scanning the surroundings. The black man rolled down his window, keeping his hands visible on the wheel. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone sharp and demanding. The black man nodded, his voice calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You didn't signal back there," the officer replied quickly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Step out of the car." The black man's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't move. "I didn't think that was necessary. I've already given you my information." The officer didn't respond directly. Instead, he stepped closer to the car, his stance becoming more aggressive. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice now tinged with frustration. The black man remained calm. "I'm just asking for an explanation. I've done nothing wrong." The officer took a step forward, his body language tense, and the second officer moved in closer as well. "Get out of the car now," the first officer snapped, his hand brushing the side of his holster. The black man took a deep breath, his composure unshaken. "I'm not getting out unless you explain why I need to." The second officer leaned in closer, his tone even sharper now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just step out of the car." The tension was now palpable. The black man could feel the situation spiraling, but he kept his voice steady. He didn't want to escalate things, but he also wasn't going to give in to baseless aggression. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "I'm just asking for an explanation." Without warning, the first officer opened the door and grabbed the black man by the arm, pulling him roughly from the car. The second officer quickly joined in, both officers now forcing him out. In the chaos of the scuffle, the black man's wallet fell to the ground, flipping open as it hit the pavement. The shiny badge inside caught the light. The officers immediately stopped, their hands still gripping the black man, but their movements stilled as their eyes fell to the wallet and the badge. They stared at it, their expressions shifting from aggression to confusion. The realization of what they had just done began to sink in, and their hands dropped away from the black man. He bent down calmly, picked up his wallet, and held the FBI badge up for them to see. "Is this why you were so quick to escalate the situation?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. The officers stood frozen, their faces drained of color. The aggressive, judgmental assumptions they had made moments ago now hung heavy in the air. They stared at the badge, struggling to comprehend the gravity of their mistake. The tension shifted from anger to embarrassment as the black man stood calmly, his composure unbroken. The flashing lights of the patrol car continued to spin, but the weight of the moment hung heavily in the silence. The officers had just crossed a line, and the reality of who they were confronting was now clear. They had wrongly assumed, acted impulsively, and now they were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. The black man stood silently, his hand on the steering wheel, as the flashing lights from the police cruiser lit up the inside of his car. He had already pulled over, just as he was trained to do. The officers had made no effort to explain why he was being stopped, and he had no reason to think it was anything more than a routine traffic violation. His mind wandered for a moment, thinking of the long day at work, his tiredness, and the peace he had expected when he finally arrived home. But that peace was shattered the moment the first officer approached the car. "License and registration," the officer said curtly, his tone sharp and dismissive. The black man slowly reached into the glove compartment and handed the officer his documents, maintaining a calm demeanor. "I'm sorry, officer," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" The officer glanced at the documents, then back at the black man, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You failed to signal when you turned back there," the officer said, pointing behind him with an exaggerated motion. "Step out of the vehicle." The black man looked at him, confused. "I don't believe I failed to signal, officer. I'm sure I did. Can you explain why you think that?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, his body language tense, and his hand hovered near his holster. "Step out of the car now," he demanded, his voice more forceful this time. The black man's hands remained on the steering wheel, his fingers gripping it lightly. "I'm not resisting, officer. I just want to understand why I'm being asked to step out of the car." The officer leaned closer, looking down at him. "You've been acting suspicious since I stopped you. You need to get out of the car now," he snapped, clearly agitated. The black man remained still, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just asking for an explanation. I've given you my information, and I've done nothing wrong." The officer's patience was thinning, and the second officer, who had been standing a little farther away, stepped forward. He was watching the situation carefully, but now moved closer with an air of authority. "You need to get out now," he repeated, his tone less polite than before. "You're making this harder than it has to be." At that, the first officer reached for the door handle, throwing it open roughly without warning. "Get out!" he shouted, grabbing the black man by the arm. The black man winced but didn't resist. "Please, I'm asking for clarity. Why do I need to step out? I'm just trying to comply with your orders." The officers didn't listen. They grabbed him with more force, pulling him out of the car roughly. His breath quickened, but he didn't fight them. Instead, he spoke in a low, controlled voice. "I work in law enforcement, too," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his FBI ID. "I'm an FBI agent. I'm not a threat to you." He held up the ID, but the officers ignored it, continuing to drag him further away from the car. The first officer, whose grip was still on the black man's arm, barely glanced at the ID before turning his attention back to the man's body. "We don't care about your ID," he spat. "You're resisting. That's all we need to know." The second officer joined in, both men now trying to pull him to the ground. The black man's calm was fading, but he remained composed, trying to de-escalate. "I'm not resisting," he repeated, but his voice was tinged with frustration now. "I'm just asking why this is happening. You've seen my ID." The first officer, clearly growing more agitated, accused him again. "You're resisting arrest. Stop being difficult." The black man could feel his pulse quicken. The aggressive behavior from the officers, despite his calm demeanor and his attempt to show them his credentials, was escalating into something far more dangerous. It was becoming clear that the officers weren't interested in his explanation. They were set on one thing: treating him as a threat. Despite his growing anxiety, he took a deep breath and fought to keep his voice steady. "Please, I don't want this to escalate," he said, as the officers continued to push him. "I'm an FBI agent. I'm not the enemy." But the officers were beyond listening. One of them grabbed his wrist roughly, twisting his arm behind his back as they moved to cuff him. They were ignoring the obvious signs: the badge, the calm voice, the credentials. The black man's mind raced, and as they continued to force him into submission, he couldn't help but wonder how much of this was due to the color of his skin, how much of this was simply a matter of their assumptions about him. He could feel his blood pressure rising, but he wasn't going to fight back. He knew all too well what could happen when you fought back during a confrontation like this, no matter how wrong the situation was. The second officer was growing more agitated as the struggle continued, trying to force the black man's hands behind his back. "Stop resisting!" he shouted again. The black man's heart pounded in his chest as the struggle continued, but he didn't give in to panic. He wasn't going to let them get away with their wrongful actions. His mind was focused on one thing: getting through this moment. He just had to stay calm long enough for them to see the truth. The black man felt the pressure building as the officers continued to drag him away from his car. Despite his attempts to stay calm, the situation was quickly escalating beyond anything he had anticipated. The officers, now physically handling him with more force than necessary, were not listening to his pleas. They weren't interested in his explanation or the credentials he had tried to show them. "Stop resisting!" one of the officers yelled again, twisting his arm behind his back. The grip on him tightened, and he could feel the officer's weight against him, pushing him toward the ground. His breath quickened, but he stayed calm, focusing on not making the situation worse. Then, in the midst of the scuffle, his wallet slipped from his pocket and fell to the ground. It landed with a soft thud, the ID inside flipping open as it hit the pavement. For a moment, everything stopped. The officers froze, their hands still on the black man, but their attention now focused entirely on the wallet. The badge inside caught the light, gleaming unmistakably. The black man took a slow, steady breath as he bent down and picked up the wallet, holding up the FBI badge in front of the officers. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air as the realization of their mistake began to sink in. Marcus, his composure never wavering, held the badge up for them to see. "Is this why you treated me like a criminal?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officers stood motionless, their faces drained of color. The earlier aggression, the accusations, the physical force, all of it was now washed away by the sudden understanding that they had wrongly assumed the man in front of them was a threat. You're FBI," the first officer stammered, his voice faltering. Marcus nodded, his expression still even, though his frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Yes, I'm an FBI agent, and I've been trying to tell you that for the past several minutes." The second officer, who had been quieter up to this point, finally spoke, but his words were filled with panic and regret. I'm sorry, sir. We didn't know. We didn't mean—" "Didn't mean what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "Didn't mean to treat me like a criminal just because of the way I look?" The officers looked down, their expressions now filled with shame. The first officer opened his mouth to speak, but stopped, unsure of how to continue. The weight of their actions was finally catching up to them. They had acted quickly, without justification, and now they were faced with the consequences of their assumptions. Marcus straightened up, pulling the wallet back into his pocket as he regained his composure. He was still trying to process what had just happened, how quickly the situation had escalated, and how the officer's behavior had been shaped by their bias rather than any real threat. "I've spent my career fighting for justice," Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable intensity. "But this isn't just about me. This is about the way law enforcement treats people based on assumptions, not facts. You didn't take the time to understand who I was. You didn't give me a chance to explain. Instead, you assumed I was a threat." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, but the first officer's face remained pale, his eyes now full of regret. The black man's words seemed to weigh heavily on them. There was no denying the truth of what he was saying. The realization of what they had done had hit them hard, and there was no excuse for their actions. Marcus took another deep breath and looked at them, his voice softening just slightly, though still firm. "You're not the only ones who have made assumptions based on appearances. I've been treated like this countless times, and every time it's been because of the color of my skin. But you are the ones with the power in this situation. You are the ones who can change how you respond." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The officers stood in front of him, their earlier arrogance and aggression replaced with a sense of guilt that they could no longer ignore. "I'm not here to punish you," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "But I am here to remind you that your actions have consequences. You need to do better. We all need to do better." The first officer nodded, his voice now barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. We made a mistake. We're sorry." Marcus nodded in response, not accepting the apology but acknowledging that it was a first step. This isn't about saying sorry. It's about changing behavior. You have a responsibility to serve and protect. That means treating everyone with fairness, not judgment. The second officer, still visibly uncomfortable, spoke again. "We understand, sir. We'll do better." Marcus looked at them one last time, his tone softening but still firm. "I hope you will. Because if this is going to change, it starts with you. It starts with all of us holding each other accountable." With that, Marcus turned and walked back to his car, his steps measured and deliberate. The officers stood behind him, still processing everything that had just happened. They had crossed a line, and now they knew it. As the black man drove away, the realization of what they had done and what they had learned hung heavily in the air. The shift in power was subtle, but undeniable. Accountability and respect were non-negotiable, and the lessons of the day had not been lost on anyone. As the police cruiser remained parked, the silence felt different now. One filled with introspection, change, and the undeniable weight of responsibility. The black man stood still, allowing the tension of the moment to settle around him. His heart was racing, but his face remained composed. The officers, still processing the weight of the mistake they had just made, stood awkwardly in front of him. Their earlier aggression had vanished, replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Marcus had already picked up the wallet, carefully tucking the FBI badge back inside. His voice, when he spoke, was even and clear, but there was an undeniable force behind his words. "You have no idea what it's like," he began, his gaze shifting between the two officers. "You've never had to worry about being treated like a threat just because of the color of your skin. You don't know what it's like to have your life questioned because of your appearance." The first officer shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. His eyes were cast downward, and his body language seemed small, as if he were already aware of how wrong the situation had been. Assumptions like that, Marcus continued, his tone becoming sharper, are why people like me feel like they have to constantly prove themselves. This wasn't a random stop. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, based on your bias, on how you saw me before you even knew who I was. The second officer, still standing stiffly, opened his mouth as if to apologize, but Marcus held up his hand, stopping him before the words came out. "Don't apologize yet," Marcus said firmly. "Your apology means nothing unless it's followed by change. You have to understand the harm you've done. You can't just act like this isn't a bigger issue." The first officer nodded, his voice barely audible. We didn't mean to. We just—" Marcus interrupted again, his voice unwavering. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is the impact. You assumed I was a threat. You treated me like a criminal. And the worst part is, I'm not the only one. I've been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment my whole life. And I work in law enforcement, just like you." He paused, letting the words settle. He could feel the officers squirming, the weight of their mistake sinking in. He wasn't done yet, though. "Your actions today aren't just a reflection of you. They reflect on the entire profession. When law enforcement members act out of assumption and bias, they undermine the very trust we are supposed to build with the community. And that's what you've done here today." As Marcus spoke, the murmurs of a growing crowd began to reach his ears. Bystanders, who had been drawn to the commotion, were watching the scene unfold. Their eyes were on the officers, some shaking their heads, others exchanging whispers. The tension among the officers grew as the judgment from the bystanders became apparent. As Marcus spoke, the murmurs of a growing crowd began to reach his ears. Bystanders, who had been drawn to the commotion, were watching the scene unfold. Their eyes were on the officers, some shaking their heads, others exchanging whispers. The tension among the officers grew as the judgment from the bystanders became apparent. One bystander, a young woman holding a cell phone, was recording the entire exchange. Another man, older and dressed in work clothes, shook his head in disbelief. "This is exactly what's wrong with policing today," he muttered to the person next to him, his words cutting through the growing silence. The officers could feel the eyes of the crowd on them, and the embarrassment was evident. Marcus, however, remained calm, his voice firm but calm as he continued. "It's not just about me. It's about how every black person, every person of color, gets treated based on assumptions and bias. You've reinforced that today, and you've made it harder for good law enforcement officers like myself to do our jobs effectively." The first officer swallowed, his earlier defiance completely gone. We didn't mean to treat you like that," he stammered, his apology coming off flat and unconvincing. "Not good enough," Marcus replied, his tone cool. "You don't get to apologize and then walk away from the consequences. You have to change your mindset. You have to recognize that your assumptions are harmful, not just to me, but to the whole community you are supposed to serve and protect." The bystanders, their murmurs growing louder, began to voice their support for Marcus. A man from the crowd called out, "He's right." "We've seen this happen too many times." Another woman chimed in, "If this was anyone else, they would have been in cuffs by now." The officers were clearly rattled now, their earlier aggression completely evaporated. The crowd's judgment, reinforced by Marcus's words, had shifted the power dynamic in an instant. The officers had no response. They stood in stunned silence, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Marcus took a step back, folding his arms across his chest. "This could have been handled differently," he said, his voice firm. "You could have asked questions. You could have treated me with the respect I deserve, just as you would anyone else. But instead, you assumed the worst. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences of that." The first officer finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time. We're sorry, sir. We made a mistake. We'll do better." Marcus didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned toward the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of the bystanders who had witnessed the entire exchange. He could feel their support in the way they stood, in the way they watched, in the way their eyes followed his every move. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said to them. "It's about all of us. It's about making sure that we are all held accountable for the way we treat each other, no matter our background, our skin color, or the uniform we wear. We cannot allow bias to guide our actions. We must hold each other accountable." The crowd was quiet for a moment, and then several people began nodding in agreement. The officers, still standing silently, seemed to shrink under the weight of the realization that they had failed in their duty. Marcus's gaze returned to the officers. "I don't expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to learn. I expect you to do better. This city, this community, this entire country deserves that." Without another word, Marcus turned and walked back to his car. As he got in and drove away, he knew this moment would leave a lasting impact. The officers would have to reckon with the consequences of their actions, and the community would remember the lesson learned. It was a small victory, but one that could start a larger change. The crowd, still buzzing with energy, began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the evening air. The judgment was clear, and the officers were left to face the reality of their mistake, while the black man, an agent of change, had made sure that the truth was heard loud and clear. The officers stood quietly, clearly shaken by the mistake they had just made. Their earlier aggression had faded, replaced by discomfort and regret. The first officer took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Sir, we are sorry. We didn't mean to treat you that way," he said, his voice low. The second officer nodded, equally remorseful. "We made a mistake. We're sorry, sir." Marcus took a moment before responding. "An apology is a good start," he said, his voice steady. "But what matters is your actions moving forward. This isn't just about me. It's about the assumptions you made about me, about every person you encounter based on their appearance." Turning to the bystanders who had gathered, Marcus spoke directly to them, his voice strong. "This isn't just one bad interaction. It's a reflection of a larger issue in law enforcement. Assumptions and bias tear down trust, both between the community and the police, and within the system itself." The crowd, drawn by the commotion, began to murmur in agreement. Some nodded, others exchanged knowing looks. Marcus continued, addressing both the officers and the people around him. "Respect isn't something you give when you feel like it," he said. "It's something that should be given to everyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like. And when law enforcement forgets that, it harms everyone." The officers stood in silence, realizing the weight of their actions. The first officer quietly spoke. "We understand, sir. We'll do better." Marcus nodded, but his tone remained firm. "I hope so, because this is the kind of mistake that can't happen again." With that, the officers retreated, their heads down, and the tension in the air lifted slightly. Marcus had made his point, clear and unflinching. The crowd, still watching, now understood the gravity of what had just unfolded. Marcus had turned a moment of aggression into a lesson on accountability and respect. As the officers drove away, Marcus remained composed, and the crowd began to disperse, talking quietly about what they had witnessed. The day's lesson was clear. Accountability begins with respect, and change starts with holding one another to a higher standard. As Marcus drove away from the scene, he reflected on the experience. The officers had made a mistake, and it was one that could have easily escalated into something much worse. But he also knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem in policing and law enforcement. Bias, assumptions, and lack of accountability had the potential to destroy the trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. A voiceover began, steady and thoughtful. The events you just witnessed are more than a simple case of mistaken identity. They highlight a deeper issue within law enforcement. Assumptions based on race, appearance, or background can have dangerous consequences. It's time to challenge these biases not only in others, but within ourselves. The voice continued, urging action. We must advocate for accountability, demand respect for all, and insist on fair treatment. Law enforcement must reflect the communities they serve, strong, fair, and just. The scene shifted to show Marcus, still deep in thought, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The change we need starts with each of us, the voice said, in the way we treat others and in the way we hold each other accountable. The message was clear. Change begins when we treat everyone with dignity and ensure fairness in all interactions. As the car drove off into the distance, the voice ended. The first step is understanding. The next is action. It's time to make change real,